In the last lecture, we've learned how to add material design icons to our report to show the state of some of our variables. Now, we're going to dive into calculated fields. So in this lesson, we're going to use the historical data of another digital input sensor, which is triggered on when a pump is running, and we're going to calculate our pump runtime with this information. So I'm going to start again with an empty canvas. Let's go back into our report, click on Page, New Page. Let's rename our page. I'm going to rename this Pump Runtime. So next, I'm going to add data again. Click on Add Data, search for Smartrek. Click on the connector. This time, select Logs. Add your credentials. As before, I'm going to do that quickly. Click on Next. Select the digital input sensor that is hooked on the two pumps. Click on Next. And select the dimensions. So in this case, it's going to be port 1, which is hooked on pump 1, and port 3, which is hooked on port 3 of my digital input sensor. So I've selected port 1 and port 3, and now let's add it to the report. So let's first peek into our data set. So to do that, we're going to add a table. So let's go ahead, select Table, add the table. We're going to select the date as the dimension and port 1 and port 3 as the metric. All right. So let's discuss what we have here. Up until now, we've been fetching live data from a sensor. We didn't really have a data set with metrics where we can run some aggregation calculation on it. Now this time, with the logs module, I've just fetched a lot more data. And if I look closely at my table, I can see that I have a timestamp and the port 1 and port 3 values at that timestamp. If I look at the bottom of the table, I can see that I have more than 30,000 pages in my table. So let's start by sorting our table by dates. Click on the table and under Sort here, change the value to Date and click on Ascending. So the first row indicates that the date started from September 21st. And if I change to descending order, my first row contains October 18th. Going back to the settings of my table, if I scroll down a bit, I have a date range. And right now it is configured to auto, which is totally fine. And if we look closer, we can see that auto means that it fetches data for the last 28 days, excluding today. So that makes sense. I just wanted to show you that we can change the date range. For now, we're going to leave it as is and focus on our calculated fields. So we've learned that metrics can be aggregated. So let's toggle the summary row on our table to see the totals of port 1 and port 3. Scroll up and click on Show Summary Row. So now we know that during this period, so the last 27 or 28 days, port 1 was high 7,203 times, and port 3 was high, 11,728 times. Now, how can we get from this information the actual pump runtime? Well, let's take a look at port 1. We know that its value was 1, 7,203 times during the period. If we know how many values we have in this table, so how many rows, that we can easily calculate the runtime ratio for port 1. So just to make this clearer, I have the number of rows with value higher than 1. Actually, it's higher than 0, equal to 1, divided by the total number of rows. And when I have this ratio, if I multiply this by the total number of hours in the period, then I would get the total runtime for port 1 over the period. So let's go back into the report. And let's start with the total number of rows. So how can we get this information? Well, it's simple. We're going to add a calculated field. I'm going to click on the table and then click on Edit Data Source. And then we're going to click on Add a Field. We're going to name this new field Values Count. And we're going to input this very simple formula with a syntax pretty similar to the formulas in Google Sheet or in Excel sheets. I'm going to write if port 1 equals to -1, then return 1, else return 1. So let me explain what we just did. So we know that port 1 is always going to return either 0 or 1. So we then know that port 1 will absolutely never equal to -1. So our if statement will then return the second argument, this one, which is 1. If port 1 was equal to -1 for some reason anyway, it actually would have returned 1 because that's what we wrote in our third argument. So this is just some dumb formula which always returns 1 for every row in the data set. Click on Save, close this. I have my new calculated field here, and click on Done. So we now have a new field here that I can drag into the metrics. So our table updates. And I now have another column called values count, and it always returns 1. So I know that the total number of rows is 30,334. So now let's create two new fields called port 1 ratio and port 3 ratio. Click on Edit Data Source and click on Add a Field. Let's name our field port 1 ratio. And then what we're going to calculate is the sum of port 1 divided by the sum of values count. Click Save, close this, add another field, and do the same for port 3. So port 3 ratio, and my formula will be sum of port 3 divided by sum of values count. Save this, click on Close. And so the last thing that we need to calculate is the number of hours in the period. So let's implement this. Let's create another field, and we're going to name this hours in period. And we're going to start by converting our date into Unix date. So Unix date, my date. So just to explain this a little bit, the Unix date is the number of days since January 1st, 1970. So it's a pretty big number, around 18,000, I'd say. And what we're going to do is that we're going to extract the max and the min Unix date from our date dimension. And then we're going to subtract the min Unix date from the max Unix date. And this is going to give us the number of days in my data set. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write max of Unix date, my date, minus min Unix date, oops, my date. There. Click on save, close this. So this new field here should return 27 days right now, because if you remember, we've selected the auto date range, which was 28 days excluding today. So that would be 27 days. And so all there is left to do is to multiply the result by 24. So let's go back into the formula and multiply this by 24 hours. So knowing that it's supposed to be 27 days, then 27 days times 24 hours, we should have 648 hours. So let's go back in the report. And now let's check that we're getting the correct value. So what we're going to do is that we're going to add a chart and add a scorecard. And let's select the last calculated field, so hours in period, and drag this into the metric. And there we have 648 hours, which is the result that we wanted. Okay, so we're all set. All there is left to do is to put all of these calculated fields together to get the pump runtime. So let's go back into the data source and add one last calculated field for each pump. So I'm going to name this runtime pump 1, and let's add in our formula. So it's going to be port 1 ratio times hours in period. Save this, close, do the same for, do the same for port 3. So runtime pump 3. The formula would be port 3 ratio times hours in period. Save this, click on close, and go back to the report. So now let's add another scorecard. And this time we're going to select runtime pump 1. And there, I can see that pump 1 ran for 154 hours. So I'm going to quickly do the same for pump 3. Change the metric. And there. So pump 3 ran for 250 hours in the last 27 days. All right, so it would also be nice if we could see this data in a pie chart with the percentage of time that pump 1 was running, the percentage of time that pump 2 was running, and the percentage of time that the pumps were idle. So let's add this in the next lecture.